We are students of the art of play,
And we do this show called The Art of Play.
a show for the players who ask why.
I'm Vi.
And I'm Gaia.
Hey Gaia, what are we talking about today?
So today we're going to be switching it up from this background of hardware and console design and console history and whatever motion controls are, and we're going to get back to one of the ideas of game design. Today, I want to talk about game balance. So game balance is one of those topics that I feel like are tragically misunderstood by a lot of players. Because have you listened to the discourse of a game like Overwatch or of Dota or League of Legends or TF2 or any competitive game, and you hear people say, this game is unbalanced, this character's unbalanced, this is overpowered,
Yes.
this is underpowered.
Yep, overpowered is something I hear a lot.
Yeah. And you hear that, and have you ever stopped and asked, why is that a bad thing?
I've usually heard it in the context of that's a good thing. You should play that thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you usually hear, this is overpowered, play it.
Yeah.
And then you might think, if you go a little bit deeper, well, how does this affect everybody else's experience playing the game? Is this going to make other people's experience more negative, and should I care? So today, I want to go into this question of game balance. Do we need to have a balanced game? Why do people want balanced games? And is there a case for imbalance to be a good thing? And not to spoil the end of the episode, the answer to that question will be yes.
Yeah.
So we have a bit of a plan today, and we're going to be answering a series of questions to get to the idea of imbalance as a topic. So the first thing I think I'll ask to you, Vi, is when someone says game balance, what do you think of?
Usually like something between two teams or, yourself versus the computer. How difficult stuff feels based on how powerful you are, right? Or the abilities that you have versus another team has, right? And are they balanced? Do they meet in the middle?
Yeah, so what would be meeting in the middle here?
Not like over buffing a character, I think. Like I'm thinking about Baldur's Gate 3 where like some characters are really powerful because they can do, the most damage per turn. So like Paladin, you can start getting really crazy once you start like multi-classing and adding little pieces of stuff, right? And then versus like, a first level sorcerer who dies from 1d4 dying damage. Like,
Yeah. There's a power imbalance there. Importantly, when we say balance, we really mean should two players of equal skill, equal ability, equal time and resources, equal everything, expect an equal outcome, right? So you can imagine this in a competitive game, like let's just pick a generic shooter A, whatever, right? If you had two players who had the exact same weaponry, exact same class, and the exact same starting point, let's say a map that is perfectly 50-50 split, you would expect the exact same result. You expect them both to have roughly the same kills, roughly the same deaths, roughly the same assists, and the final score to be 50% both sides. Game balance, in the most strict terms, is equal effort, equal skill for equal outcome.
yeah, but that sounds like the worst kind of game. It sounds like you're always meeting a stalemate. So
It does.
game balance, I think, has to be the kind of thing where you balance opposing abilities, right?
Yeah.
You're better at this thing and this person is worse at it, so that might give you an advantage, but they also have another way
Yeah.
to have a hand on over you.
And that's something we're really going to get into this episode. So there's another question with game balance, now that we know what it is. Why do people care so much about game balance? Why do we hear people constantly discussing balance as the first and foremost thing when discussing games in general? And I'll ask that to you, Vi. Why do you think people are so heavily focused on game balance?
I think because it's one of those things that you can talk about without knowing a lot about game design, right? Because it's something that you feel when you're playing, right? It's something that's really easy to talk about. Like we talk about this show being something that gives players language for talking about why they like a game, why they don't like a game, what makes a game good, right? And I think this is one of the things that if you don't listen to our show, you've heard about because it's easy to talk about, right? And it's
Yeah.
easy to see within the game.
The language is very accessible.
Yeah.
But keep in mind that when we talk about game balance, we usually talk about competitive games. Now, we're going to ignore games like Warcraft for now, although they will come up. We generally mean games where a team is fighting another team. And you hear balance come up when someone is talking about having lost a game. Importantly, you hear game balance when someone has died to another character and says, that character's overpowered, that weapon's overpowered, the map is unbalanced, they have an advantage.
Yeah.
They're off putting their loss rather than a lack of skill or a skill difference, onto something outside of their control. They're saying this factor was out of my control, and if it was in my control, I would have won. But you don't hear that from the other side quite often. When someone wins in a competitive game, they are skilled. They're a good player. They played well. They clip it and upload it on YouTube for 5-second clips or Twitch or whatever. Game balance is a one-way discussion. And without me going into the hordes of articles and videos about this, when you hear about game balance, you don't hear someone saying, this game is well balanced, although you might from like journalists. You often hear, this is unbalanced and it's causing me to lose and now I'm angry. Game balance isn't a happy discussion. It's a discussion you have when you're angry. It's a discussion you have when you feel out of control about an event that's happened to you and you don't want to blame yourself. So when people are saying they want balance, what they're saying is, I want to win because I'm obviously a good player.
Now, I will say that in the case where you're not playing a competitive game, you can still hear the conversation about balance, but it tends to be about different aspects of the game and different strategies to play the game.
Yeah, this is especially true in like deck builder games where someone will say these cards are objectively bad.
Yeah.
Now, there's a whole discussion on game balance of deck builders that we're not really going to get too much into today, but there's the idea in game design that sometimes you add items or cards or things to a game that are objectively bad, so the player knows to pick the good one. This is known as red herring design. There's tons of episodes and content on this from Extra Credits that sadly I didn't go into when preparing this episode, though it is a very interesting thing that we will talk about later, how to design around skill and design skill into decision making. But oftentimes that's bad design as well. Right? Because some player might not see a good strategy from early on. I think we actually talked about this in one episode, how when we're discussing skill trees, there might be a skill tree that looks bad, but when you put everything together, you suddenly have the best strategy in the game, but you don't discover that until 100 hours in, and now you don't have access to it, and how that's bad design.
Right.
I think that was in one of our first episodes we discussed that, actually.
We've been doing the show for like 2 years, and
We've
you're
been
asking
doing
me
this
to
for a
talk
while.
about what we talked about in like the 3rd episode.
So we have an idea of why people care about game balance. They care about game balance because they're angry. Now, there's tons of other reasons. Developers care about game balance because they want players to keep playing their game. Other players care about game balance because they want to feel rewarded for their time and effort. They want to feel like it's not pay to win, right? But it always comes down to good game balance is unnoticed. Bad game balance makes you angry.
Yeah, this is, again, one of those, I think every topic that we've talked about, with the exception of some, is you notice a good thing when it doesn't impede your play, right?
Yeah.
When you access a game and you can just play it and you can just have fun doing it and you don't have to like looking up a puzzle or something. Different topic. But if you could reasonably figure something out, that's good game design. You only notice bad game design when it impedes your play.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And this is one of those ideas of you don't notice something when it's good, but you do notice it when it's bad.
You do notice it when it's bad.
If you do your job right, nobody will know you did your job at all.
Yeah.
And this is definitely one of those. So let's ask the next question, especially amongst players. What is the theory of game balance? What is the ideas that players talk about? Now, admittedly, this section of the episode is quite anecdotal. It's usually from talking to players, listening to them online, and seeing what people say. The good news is gamers don't stop talking about their game experiences.
Yeah.
It's really easy to get an overall picture. Even if your picture's out of date by a couple of years, you have a solid picture. And generally speaking, it is true that people want balance. And when we talk about balance, we usually talk about competitive play. Cooperative games have balance. Single-player games have balance. But people don't talk about this single-player game is balanced. They say this single-player game is exploitable or not.
Yeah.
But in multiplayer, it's all about balance. And people talk about wanting a perfectly balanced game. And let's talk about a perfectly balanced game for a second. Let's pick out probably one of the most well-known perfectly balanced games. Chess.
Oh, joy.
Chess is a perfectly balanced game. And what you will often hear people say when they discuss chess is this is a strategic game. It requires deep thinking, deep knowledge. Chess is not a strategic game.
No, chess is about memorizing responses to moves. Yeah.
Like, I had this argument with someone earlier today where they said chess is a really strategic game and it requires you to think deeply and be knowledgeable. And I said, yeah, if you're a grand master. Because let's think about chess for a second. You have a perfectly equal board with perfectly equal pieces and perfectly equal starting positions and scores.
Except that your queens face each other.
Except that the queens face each other, which is still effectively equal, let's be quite honest.
Yeah.
And
it just prevents you from playing the exact same game your opponent is playing against you.
You could probably play the exact same game. We'll get into why you can't, but when it comes to chess, it's perfectly balanced. You can play roughly the same strategies, and the only difference is who's going first. And that's the problem with chess. It all depends on who goes first. The white player, the first player in chess, has a 0.7 score advantage at the start of the game, which is just about one pawn extra of advantage. Yeah. And the reason for that is because they go first, because it affects their win rates. That the second player has a lower chance to win because they are reacting to the first player.
Yeah, you're always reacting.
Yeah, and the thing about chess then is you can imagine, here's how the learning curve of chess goes. You're a brand new player who just knows the rules, and you're playing against probably other brand new players or people with a little bit of experience. So you're making up strategies, trying new things, seeing what works, and if you're careful, analyzing where something went wrong.
Yeah.
And considering most new players are really bad at that because they don't know how to analyze the game, they might not even do that. You play a lot of chess, you get used to it, and you want to get a leg up on your opponents, so you go to start learn chess properly. From this point until you're a grand master, everything that you're doing is memorizing chess strategies and employing them. Because if you know there's a strategy that leads towards victory, and then you don't play that strategy, you're objectively increasing your chance of losing.
Yes.
So don't play that strategy. It's all memorization. And there's another really good example of this. We know that real-time strategy games like StarCraft, Age of Empires, etc. are known as pinnacles of strategy. But at one point in time, the StarCraft developers wanted to make their game more balanced, and they focused really hard on all teams being equal. So they had roughly the same abilities, roughly the same outcome, roughly the same approaches. They may have had a difference in like this team is good at heavy units, this team is good at light units, but overall it was perfectly balanced. And from that point until they debalanced the game, which is a wild concept, no one was thinking about strategy. The best players were those who had the highest actions per minute, who could click the fastest and keep track of the highest number of things, which, don't get me wrong, that is incredibly important. But if your winning or losing is based on how quickly you can execute your strategy, that's not a strategy game anymore. Pick the most likely strategy to win, execute it the fastest, win. That's it.
Yeah.
There's no strategic depth. Your opponent can't counter it because you're playing faster.
Yeah.
Even if they build the counter units, you see they're building counter units, and with more speed, build the thing that counters those. You're objectively better because you're faster. And that was a horrible moment for StarCraft. A perfectly balanced game. Sure, it has its advantages. People enjoy chess. People enjoy action per minute StarCraft. But overall, it doesn't produce a fun, unique experience.
Right.
You're all doing the same thing. Who can do it faster?
Yes, you're all trying to get that upper hand on, I can do this the fastest.
Personally, from my own opinion on this one, that's no different than a button mashing game in like Mario Party, right? Who can press the A button the fastest?
Yeah.
It's the same concept. You're not thinking, you're executing.
Yep.
Which, sure, that is always true at high-level play. Your amount of thinking goes down, and you're only thinking about edge cases.
It does change the accessibility of the game, too.
A lot.
A lot.
Yeah.
And especially if you're trying to be a strategic game, often that means, that a game requires you to, like, play differently, right? If you have a strategic game, a lot of people want to sit there and, like, kind of think about it for a little bit before they move. Right? That's chess.
Yeah, that would be a turn-based strategy game. Civilization has that exact same feature.
Right.
Although Civilization is not a perfectly balanced game. And I have my complaints as someone who cares about game balance and likes to rage when I lose because of game balance.
Yeah.
Because I'm still one of those players.
So all of these like people online who you're like, oh, you know how people don't like game balance? That's just you.
It's me too.
It's just you.
The thing is, like, that's a natural reaction.
Yeah.
To say this was out of my control and I lost, it must have been the thing out of my control.
Yes.
I have thousands of hours in the Civ series.
Yes, you should be quite a good player.
Yeah, so when I lose to someone with like 100 hours playing the best Civ in the game, I don't blame myself for not countering their strategy.
Right.
I could have countered their strategy. The best Civ in the game is gold and trade focused. Go raid their trade routes and they are useless.
Yeah.
but I don't do that, and then I blame them when I lose, when I'm not playing optimally. I should just declare war, raid their trade routes, or pay the barbarians to do it. Right? There's ways to counter them, and I still blame them. It's a problem that affects me as much as it affects everybody else. And I went on their case, but yeah.
Yeah.
But another issue with game design and balance is think about how we think about balance for a second. We balance a game so players are equal, which means we balance around matchmaking. We balance so two teams who have equal skill have an equal experience.
It requires players that have equal skill and experience, though.
Yeah.
Which you don't necessarily always have.
We're not balancing around fun.
Sure.
Have you ever sat down and played a game with a friend who's objectively better at the game than you?
Oh, yeah.
And so you pick the easier strategy and still have an equal chance of winning.
That has never happened to me.
I've done that tons of times. Actually, in Civ, this is really common. That really good Civ I mentioned, who I lose against new players, it's because it's an accessible strategy to new players. I can counter it, but I have to be careful to counter it. And this is true for a lot of games. You don't need players of equal skill to have equal fun. And yet, all of our balanced decisions are around equal skill.
Yes.
Which is interesting, but it does lead to a question now. Should we actually be balancing around this competitive play, this equal skill, this high level of skill? And I'll ask that to you, Vi. Do you think we should be balancing around, let's say, high-level play, competitive play, this skill-focused balance?
Well, I think that assumes that when you release a game, you're going to have players that stick around enough to be experienced high-level players.
Yeah, which most games want that because those players spend a lot of money and a lot of time.
Definitely, right? Like that is your goal. You want a game to be playable for a long time, right? And for people to enjoy it for a long time. But I think part of the problem is if you don't balance it well up front when you have low-skill players, they're never going to get to the point of playing good players, right? Or you'll have like a small collection of good players playing new players, and it still won't be fun because you haven't balanced it in the right direction.
I remember I was playing a game series, and you know what? I want to say this was Age of Empires, although Age of Empires' new balance system is really good, where they had a lot of this was Team Fortress 2, actually. They had a lot of really good professional players who played the game nonstop or constantly playing it, and every new player who came into the game was getting destroyed by bots or good players because the balance, they didn't balance around skill, or they did balance around skill, but not perfectly because there wasn't as many players. So the new player would get, completely stepped on,
right,
and then would leave the game and not play it again. So the only players that remained were the high skill players, which, they eventually stopped playing. So they had this ever dwindling list of high skill players, but new skill players weren't joining the game.
Yeah.
I think they mostly turned that effect around now, but keep in mind, TF2 is now nearly 20 years old because it came out in 2007.
Yeah. There's been new games since then, I think. Just a few.
But TF2 is really good. But yeah, they've been struggling with this. And other games like Age of Empires have struggled with this too, getting new players and making them feel welcome. I recently was listening to an Age of Empires video from Spirit of the Law on this, where he was talking about how the ELO ranking system puts new players against players who are more skilled than them, and they have to lose like 5 games in a row to get to their real skill level. What are you going to do when you lose 5 games in a row in multiplayer?
Leave.
Yeah. And they were.
Yeah.
Extensively. It was bad. But there is another question I had in here, and this is going to kind of lean into what we're going to be recording later for our next episode, and that's, how do we balance cooperative games? And this is a question I'll ask you, Vi, especially because this will be something we're talking about later. We've constantly talking about balancing cooperative games. How do we balance, or competitive games, how do we balance non-competitive games?
I saw a board game that was launched recently as a Kickstarter where one player plays as a squid who's hiding from the other player who's playing as a shark. And so my answer is just asymmetrical play, right? Where you can be doing different things, but they're not necessarily skill related, right? Or where one person has the upper hand. You're just playing a slightly different game on either end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's especially going to be a theme today. So let's summarize, if we even want perfect balance, for a second. Summarize the previous discussion, and this is in my, the next big thing in the topic list. In a perfectly balanced game, only new players and masters make strategies. This is the chess problem. This was the StarCraft problem, right? as well, suddenly things like turn order or actions per minute or other major measures that aren't strategy become how you win the game.
Right.
So being a knowledgeable player means nothing. Being a player with a big memory means everything, right? This isn't true for some games. Like, my knowledge of Civ is why people come to ask me like Civ questions or strategy questions, because I can make the perfect strategities. But that's not memorization.
Wow, what a humble brag, Gaia.
Okay,
what a
stop.
brag. No, I'm sorry. I was like, I'm just gonna sit here like I have the. No, come on.
Yeah, okay. But very seriously, people ask me for a lot of advice when playing Civ on what is a good strategy, and my answer is always money. Just focus money,
right?
Because that's accessible for new players.
Right. You understand how the game values different things.
Yeah.
Right, and how that propels good game choices.
Yeah, but people come to me with these questions,
of course,
and also like Google them and ask other experienced players, because there isn't one good strategy, and what you should do depends on your scenario.
Yes, and they're looking for opinions on specific scenarios.
Yeah, like usually where to put their cities. To be quite honest, that's the hardest thing to learn in Civ.
Cool.
But yeah, in a perfectly balanced game, you don't have that. The answer is always one true answer. And continuing, it's hard to balance around like new players, because new players will play suboptimally. They won't maximize their strategies. They're not going to invest resources in becoming a pro player in the game. They're not skilled enough to abuse the unbalanced things. So when you balance around them, a good player is going to shoot for the stars.
Right.
And that's probably not very fun if you're a good player. It means all the good players play the same thing.
Yeah.
But you also can't balance around the pros. You can run into the issue that half the game might not be playable unless you're a pro who can maximize one very specific game mechanic.
Yeah.
Because otherwise the character's useless.
Right.
Right? I imagine this in Team Fortress 2, where there was a strategy where, as the character who uses a rocket launcher, you had a parachute. And what people do is they'd open and close the parachute very quickly to stay in the air for longer and to move around in the air faster, so that they could be more mobile in a situation where they're hard to hit.
Right.
And casual players just straight up couldn't do that, because it's actually really hard to do that. You have to be pressing like 4 or 5 buttons simultaneously. But the pros were doing it all the time. And if they didn't balance around the pros, this strategy would be abusable, which is exactly what happened. But then when they balanced around the pros and nerfed the ability to open and close the parachute, the casual players got upset, because they did want to open and close it a couple of times to have better control over their movement. So how do you deal with that? It's a hard question. You can't balance around just one group. It's usually best to build systems that are beneficial to both groups.
Yes, or changeable.
Or changeable, yeah, which is often very hard. And this can often lead, again, to meta problems where, let's say you design a character that's accessible for new players and a character that's really hard for new players but could be more powerful. Then you do still have a developing meta.
Right.
New players play this, medium players play this, and good players play this. Done.
I'm thinking about how many friends of mine have played different run-throughs of Baldur's Gate 3 to try to optimize different things and to play different origins within the game.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Baldur's Gate is actually really good at individual balance.
Oh, for
overall.
sure. Yeah.
I find it does our next topic very well. So we understand balance. We understand where its problems lie and how hard it is to balance a game to some reasonable degree. So what's the solution? Well, what if we stopped caring as much about balance and focused on making a game that's fun?
Now, I will say, a lot of these topics could be solved if we just didn't care about them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we still don't want players coming in and getting angry that they lost something under their control.
For sure.
So weirdly enough, we don't want to care about balance, but we have to care enough that players aren't facing a situation where they're losing for things outside of their control, right? So let's think about how we can build an imbalanced system that is still fun.
Nice.
So the idea here is relatively, well, I guess, I was going to say simple, but maybe not.
It's simple in concept. The execution of it is very
horrible.
Challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea is to create a system that is imbalanced in a way that's fun, but doesn't make players feel like it's out of their control. And there's a few ways to do this. And you brought up an idea of this earlier, Vi. So I might pass this over to you first, of the idea of designing asymmetrically.
Yes. I think this just comes down to, like, what are you focused on when you play something that is either cooperative or competitive? So when you're doing something like playing Stardew with another person, you're basically just playing the same game twice, right? You now have the ability to do a little bit more in a day, right? But, you know, it's really hard to design a game that is asymmetrically balanced because you have to have each buff be countered with a different buff on the other side, right? So that each person has, you know, if this was a 2-player game, right, where each person can play a different strategy based on the team that they're on or the build they've picked.
Yeah, and actually, I really like this example of Stardew, and I want to focus in on that.
Cool.
Because that's the concept of specialized balance. The idea here is you can have 2 teams that are perfectly equal in the onset of the game. You start Stardew Valley, and let's say you're playing that 4-player map that's perfectly balanced, and you have 4 players all in different quadrants. From that moment, and let's say they have split currency just to make life easy, from that moment, every player is the same. They have the same starting point, the same resources, the same access to further resources, the same development path, the same conversations, everything. But how these players go about playing the game could be different, but equally valuable. You can imagine the player who focuses on farming. They plant seeds, do watering, get fertilizer, tilling, clearing land. That's a very valuable strategy, and it can earn you a lot of money very quickly.
But it's not the same as the person who just goes, I think I'll be fishing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fishing gives you quicker, earlier returns on your money, but doesn't snowball as much as farming does. But it's a perfectly valid strategy to get lots of early game money and to turn that into valuables. Actually, once you reach maximum level fishing, you gain access to tools that make fishing more profitable and give you the things the other strategies would give you.
Yeah.
Farming has much the same thing. Farming and giving gifts using your farmed goods gets you rewards that helps you progress. Another player might be big on mining and fighting because those two things tend to go together. You're going through the mines, you're getting good resources, upgrading your tools, going deeper in the mines, getting more resources, upgrading your tools. It's a little linear.
Yeah.
But then you have the player who's all on foraging, finding resources on the ground, using it to craft and upgrade and to build new food, new tools, and more importantly, gifts for the villagers, which give return on investment as they give you recipes to let you build more gifts.
I just really like that the most important thing here was giving people more gifts.
Yeah, Stardew was very big on giving
Yeah.
gifts. But also importantly, because each of these players are doing different strategies, they can trade with each other. I give you some iron, you give me some seeds so I can plant crops easily. And that's also extremely effective because now it means there is an incentive to play differently.
Yes, but now you have the balance that comes from that, right?
Yeah.
Which is that now you can share things so that everybody does better.
Yeah, this is particularly an instance of cooperative games. We're going to be talking about this a lot more in the next episode as a form of independent cooperative games. But there's also the same concept in competitive games. You can imagine a game like, what's a game of skill trees? We can think of, what's its name? World of Warcraft.
Yeah.
Right? World of Warcraft is a mixture of cooperative and competitive overall. And your idea is as a single player to reach higher levels. But in that game, everybody starts off in one of 2 camps. I think it's Alliance and Horde are the 2. Good and evil. They start in good or evil. And the good side is a little more lame overall. From what I've heard. I don't play World of Warcraft. But you start off roughly the same. But you can pick your class, pick your path, pick your tools, pick your upgrades, pick the items you use, design your house, design your build and your buffs. And you specialize around a certain strategy. And that strategy could be wildly different from other players, even the people you're playing against. But you started off the same.
Right.
The same is true actually for some shooter games like CSGO, where which weapons you choose to use in the game drastically changes your role. You could pick a sniper rifle or the Negev, which is just a machine gun that you carry in your hands, like a full machine gun in your hands. You might choose an assault rifle or a shotgun. And those fundamentally change your playstyle. And if you're good at that playstyle, it means you can still win the game. Now, there is the issue in team games where a team of all snipers versus a team of all shotgunners is not a balanced game.
Right.
And we'll get into that.
Yeah.
But this
I would argue that that feels more like playing like 2 independent players against each other versus 2 teams.
Yeah.
Because the idea of 2 teams would be to have different skill sets. Otherwise, why are you doing that.
Yeah. But you can balance around specialization. Both teams are equal, same access to resources, same access to everything. But all of the different specializations make them good at an individual thing that they can play. What does this mean in practice? What this means is the game isn't perfectly balanced. There are many different ways to play the game, and they all have their advantages and their weaknesses, and they're not the same, and how you play depends on how your opponent plays.
Right.
But it's still fair. A player who's good at sniping and a player who's good at using an assault rifle could still be perfectly equally balanced and it come down purely to their skill levels, but they're playing completely differently.
Yes.
Now, CSGO actually gives us another really good example of asymmetrical play that I would like to get into, and that's asymmetrical goal setting.
Mm-hmm.
The idea here is probably actually the easiest one to implement in terms of game design. What if you had two competitive teams and they weren't playing the same game?
Right.
Identically, I mean. They weren't playing an identical game. In CSGO, this is actually very simple. We have two teams, CT and T. I'm going to call them C and T to make life really easy. For Team C, the goal is to completely defeat Team T. That's it. It's a deathmatch. Defeat all of them, you're done.
Mm-hmm.
For Team T, they have two approaches. They can play deathmatch and defeat the other team, which the other team might have a better spawn, so that's not always a good idea, or plant the bomb and have it blow up after a timer, which means they don't need to play deathmatch. They can play attack defend.
Mm-hmm.
You have two teams playing different games.
Yeah, one of them is essentially playing like capture the flag, and the other one is playing like you're all gonna die.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can imagine the different effects this would have on your strategy. If you're on Team C, you're all about building a maximized build for taking down your opponents. But if you're on Team T, you could be all focused on hiding and defense and like catching people off guard and ambushing because you're just defending a single point.
Mm-hmm.
You can choke point them.
For sure. Or you could build them to be deathmatch. Like you could just go 1 for 1.
Yeah. And for Team C, you could also imagine this the other way. Once they've planted the bomb, you're playing attack defend as well. Your goal is to defuse the bomb.
Mm-hmm.
So you could design a build all around getting to the bomb and defusing it rather than focusing on killing their entire team.
Mm-hmm.
And those are two different skill sets entirely. But having those two skill sets means that you can play a different game. Now, this is actually especially true for one of my personal favorite games, Team Fortress 2, which has a ton of balance issues, but this asymmetrical goal setting is not one of them. Right? One idea is the game mode push the cart. One team's goal is to push a cart to the end. The other team's goal, stop them. So there's two completely different play styles. One is playing deathmatch and the other one's playing push a cart. If you can avoid death...
Sorry, one of them's playing push a cart.
Yes, that's the game.
Yeah, I know.
Push. It's more so King of the Hill, but the hill's moving.
Yeah.
Right? But you can imagine that there's a full strategy around keeping people away from the hill if you're doing like
we want to move it. Yeah. Just keep everybody away.
Keep away. We're going to push it.
Yep.
And the other team's goal is to kill you.
Yeah.
Just straight up kill you.
Yeah.
Right? Or there's other game modes as well. There is a deathmatch game mode and there's a capture the flag game mode, right? And again, the play styles can be very different, attack versus defend. And then there's attack defend, where one group has to entrench a location, the other group has to take the location. And when they take it, that first one is now entrenching a new location, and your goal is to keep pushing forward. You're attacking the other team, trying to capture their final base, which is very asymmetrical, right? It's generally believed on such an attack-defend map, the defense team is going to play heavies and area of effect characters and close-range characters, or sniper for people who are approaching. And the attack team is going to be all about destruction. So grenades, rocket launchers, quick-moving units like the scout, or the spy to infiltrate a base.
For sure.
Those are two completely different subsets of gameplay styles. And this is not to mention that whole thing we talked about specialization, is also true for the various classes in Team Fortress 2. I mentioned the scout who moves quickly and the spy who's all about hiding and breaking in. There's the medic all about healing and the pyro who has a flamethrower. That's their entire personality. Mm-hmm. That's also an example of this difference in specialization that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
But differences in goal setting make a perfectly applicable way for us to approach this problem, which I find very interesting. And we can think of other games that do different goal setting as well. Like you can think of this in cooperative games. And I would ask you, Vi, have you ever played Portal 2?
No, I haven't.
So the Portal 2 cooperative multiplayer has you playing as two robots who are moving throughout the portal facilities. And here's the thing. you're playing two completely different puzzles, just completely different. And sometimes you can't even see each other. So it's two different games, but you have to, for much of this time period, pass resources to each other so you can beat your puzzles. You're playing two games that require two completely different skill sets, but you both need to be able to do your skill sets to be able, for the other player to be able to win. And that is a completely different way of thinking about it, but asymmetrical goal setting allows you to handle balance in a way that's a bit more effective.
Yeah.
Right? It also means that it's okay if one character is really good at attacking.
Yes.
Because what happens if they're defending? They lose.
Yeah.
Right? Now, it does run the risk of creating a meta around if you're on this team, pick this class.
Yeah.
Which is why you do need other forms of imbalance. But
at least it gives you more variation than we're going to play this skill tree every time because it's just the best one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's another really good example of different goal setting in the context of cooperative games that you would have some stuff to talk about, Vi. And that's the difference between being a dungeon master and a player in D&D.
Yeah.
Would you like to kind of...
Well, this is one of those things that's like when you look at, role-playing games generally, like the DM is playing a fundamentally different game than the players are because the DM, goes away and creates the game, creates the world, creates the opportunity for players, right? And every week has to do the prep before they sit down and essentially like negotiate with players their way through this world, right? And they do that in a way that is very different than the players who just make choices, right? When they're presented with different opportunities, right? And those two things, it's incredibly asymmetrical, right? And if you don't care for one, you might really enjoy the other, right? Like if you really enjoy being a player, right? Because you like reacting in the moment and like improvising and thinking your way around problems, you might not really enjoy being on the other side of it, presenting the problems really well. So yeah, D&D is really asymmetrical, but also kind of cooperative just because you're at a table with your friends, right? But other tabletop RPGs, don't have that same work imbalance that D&D has. Like I'm thinking about ones that are a little bit more improvised, like, Wanderhome comes to mind for that one, but also there's one that's made by J Dragon as well, and it is Sleepaway, which is another improvised game where you kind of different things happen within the game, but you're all essentially playing the same game because it's improvised. There's no prep that has to happen before you sit down to the table. And other games like Blades in the Dark still have that DM player imbalance, but it's not as abrupt in terms of workload and like what happens at the table.
Yeah, and you can also imagine, very interestingly, the DM has to play the role of being the developer doing the balance decisions.
Yeah.
And let's think about being a DM for a second. We haven't talked about our last form of systems of imbalance, but this doesn't apply to D&D, so we'll do the D&D discussion here. You can imagine as a DM, if you have a party of all characters who are good at combat. You have a fighter, you have a paladin, and you have, barbarian, right? You can imagine the kinds of challenges you'd throw at them to make things feel fair, right? You would probably throw harder fight challenges that are pushed through like hordes of enemies. Yeah. But what happens now if one player on that team's a bard? The bard's not going to do much in combat. They're not going to have fun, and it's going to be imbalanced for them if they focus on that combat. They're just dealing with hordes of enemies, buffing their team, and then going on their phone.
Yeah, this is one of the things about D&D that I think is not great, is that when you have a party who is like martial based, their way out of any kind of conflict is we're going to fight them, right?
Yeah.
Because I can't get out of this any other way, right? I can't roll charisma high enough to pass that check.
But imagine now this party of 3 marshals who push through everything and 1 bard. That bard is having a less fun experience initially. Mm-hmm. So Vi, as a DM, how would you balance your game to make sure that everybody has equal fun if you have 3 super intense martial classes and then 1 high charisma bard?
Well, I think you offer moments where each skill set is, at its best, right? When you get into, because that class makeup sort of has 3 people and the one front man, right? You have a band is what's happening here. So when you encounter a situation where you kind of want players to role play to learn things about somewhere, you know that the bard is going to take the lead on it, right? So you can just build them the space to say like, hey, you know, this is a thing where, I don't know, the musician in this tavern has canceled, right? And the barkeep, who you know has this thing that you want or has this piece of information you need, has a problem, right? And then the bard can go, great, why don't I offer to go get on the stage, right? And then it's like, okay, roll performance, right? But the backup always being like, you know, you're also a person who has 3 intimidating people in the room, right? Right. So maybe you can kind of flip that balance and be like, try to roll under your intimidation. Try to not look threatening so that these people will help you, right? Like you can play that way. Or when you get into combat, you know what the bard is going to be doing, so you can set up a puzzle or something that the bard can be doing while the other players kind of
New game
fight.
mode, defend the bard.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, you have lots of different ways around it, including like suggesting to your players that somebody else, please, for the love of God, play something that is more charisma based, right? Or hey, what kind of game are we interested in playing? Right? You can just have the open conversations, right? What are you actually interested in? Because what we have right now is really fighter heavy. Do we actually want to play a game that's really fighter heavy? Or, you know, should some of us multi-class?
Yeah. And you can think of this in terms of balance as a DM. How you approach these problems is going to be very different, and you will be doing asymmetrical goal setting.
Yeah.
There are multiple goals. Each of them progress the overall task. And each person can work on different goals that at the same time helps everybody else.
Yeah.
And this asymmetrical goal setting gives us a way of making sure everybody's having fun and everybody's engaged and balanced, but also that no one's overpowered. No one feels like they're the only person, but no one feels left out.
Yeah. I will also say that like who you have playing what class makes a really big difference.
Oh, yeah,
right?
But in terms of, that's not as much of a balance discussion as that is a D&D discussion.
Well, I think it can be a balanced discussion because you can set problems and things for the players to solve as opposed to setting it so that the like characters solve them, right? You can kind of play it in a meta way because you're playing D&D, right? Like that doesn't really happen in a lot of other like gameplay places, but when you're at the table of D&D and I know that like my family game, for example, my dad and my brother are like super smart and really good at problem solving, but they're both playing martial classes, right? And so I know when I give the table a puzzle, they're both going to try to solve it as themselves, right? My brother is not going to play his Goliath barbarian to try to solve the puzzle, right? He's going to be more intelligent, right? So you have to kind of narratively make that work.
Yeah,
right?
But it still comes down to this. Everybody has a role, and you can balance your game around these different specializations with different goals.
For sure.
And you still get to an enjoyable experience.
Yes.
And it's weird thinking of balance in terms of cooperative games, because when we say balance, we always mean, I don't want to die to the person who's better than me. But as much, you also want to say, I don't want to feel unimportant for a team.
See, that's so funny to me because when you talk about game balance, my first thought is cooperative play.
That's probably because you play more cooperative games.
Yeah, that's
cooperative games
reasonable.
are less common in general, and when most people play competitive games, and when we think about balance, we think of making an enjoyable competitive experience.
Yeah.
But just as importantly, you don't want someone in a game to feel left out.
Yes, exactly.
And this is a huge risk in cooperative games in terms of their balance.
And that's, I think, part of the reason I enjoy cooperative games more than I do competitive is because I don't like the feeling of, you know, as we've talked about before, I don't love the feeling of like I'm being left out or I'm not playing as well as I could because, you know, I don't know this game as well, right? Or, you know, they have those buffs that I don't have yet, right? And leveling is sort of a different question here, right?
Yeah.
If you haven't played as much and you're not as high a level, you're just not going to be able to compete. But that's an understandable difference versus we both started in the same place at the beginning of this game and we are branching differently.
Yeah. Now, there's one more type of imbalance that I want to talk about that does not apply to D&D at all because this is a competitive only form of balance now. We always say that it's wrong to have a single strategy that dominates the game. But is it? Imagine this for a second. There's a character in a game, and it's a competitive game where you pick a class and it's a free-for-all, okay? You pick a character, and this character is objectively the best. They win nearly every scenario they're in. They have the best abilities, have the highest DPS, most damage, most speed, whatever. And then there's one character that directly counters them. That is the character who beats them.
Yeah.
Well, now everybody's going to be playing that good one and then people slowly start switching to this counter, and everyone plays a counter. But that counter is not the best.
Yeah.
Other people can beat that counter pretty easily, so people play those.
Mm-hmm.
And then people play whoever beats that one, and whoever beats that one, and whoever beats that one, until it goes all the way back to the first one, and then people play the first counter again.
Mm-hmm.
This is known as cyclical imbalance, although I've seen a dozen names for it. I just think the word cyclical is really fun to say.
It makes a lot of sense. Like cyclical as the word that we use for this makes a lot of sense because it is a cycle.
It's a cycle.
Everybody's like, oh, I want to be powerful. And then you work down the skill tree until you're like, oh, why are we not playing the powerful character anymore?
Yeah. And I've heard discussions from people before saying this is lazy game design. You're just saying this is the best meta, now this is the best meta, now this is the best meta, now we're back to the first one. But I think it's actually really clever because it forces players to be good at varieties of things. And let's think about a team game. You have 2 teams of 5. One of you plays the best character, but you know the opponents will pick the counter. So you pick the counter to that. Mm-hmm. And now each player on your team is designed to counter a different strategy and to assist the best player. Right. And that best player plays the good class that destroys everything. Mm-hmm. But now you have a variety of play styles that people have to be good at because they're trying to beat their opponents.
Yes, or you have the best player play the worst character because they know how they could exploit it because they've played enough, right? So you can give the person who's like brand new to the game the most powerful character because it's like you know you're gonna do well. Yeah. Right? Like
you just need someone to help with the counters.
Like what's a like button masher? Like
button masher?
I don't know, like Age of Calamity, right? Where like Link is objectively the best character, right? Mm-hmm. He just is, and he's the most powerful, and you tend to play him the most, so he tends to get buffed a lot. When you bring another player into that game, just give them Link, right?
Yeah.
This is the playing with your younger brother approach, right?
It kind of is, but keep in mind cyclical imbalance is heavily designed for competitive play.
100%. I'm just saying there's another situation where this applies, which is the like younger players are often also inexperienced in more ways.
Yeah. And cyclical imbalance is especially fun because it's one of the easier ones to insert. All you need is a team for this to be effective. And this is the type of balance that is used in MOBAs. So games like Dota, League of Legends, all the other ones that I used to know about and then fell off the face of the earth a few years ago.
Yeah.
These games here make use of cyclical imbalance to encourage larger varieties in teams because now you will probably have 10 characters. And then you insert a system where people can ban certain characters from the other team. Yeah. Everybody gets one ban. Mm-hmm. And suddenly your favorite character is getting banned. You need to have a second favorite character. And you get a wide variety of play.
Yes.
Now, there's one other thing that I wanted to talk about. And we have about 5 minutes left in today's episode. And that's the idea of what if we did want full balance? Let's say the system is too complicated. It's not chess. And getting full perfect balance without making everybody the same. Rather than employing these systems, what other systems do games tend to employ? And why were we so heavily focused on asymmetrical play rather than these other systems? So you can imagine a game like Civilization. Just picture a Civilization game in your head. And you know that one player is better than the other, but you want a balanced, fun experience. And let's say they didn't pick the perfect civs to balance their skill levels. They're picking the most fun civs for them.
Yeah.
What as a game do you do to create a balanced experience? And the problem is there's no easy solution to this. Yeah. One solution for this is random chance. You just do random chance balancing. There are random events in the game that give you buffs or debuffs, and the good player gets all the bad randomness, and the bad player gets all the good randomness to equalize them. As a good player, that feels horrible.
Yeah.
And as the bad player, that feels horrible.
Yeah, it's not great. Yeah.
Because you're being pitied. Mm-hmm. You're just being pitied. It feels demoralizing.
Yeah, I understand why you might take that way out, but it's not the best option.
Yeah. Extra Credits did a great video on this 11 years ago. Yeah, no, they've been around for a while.
Yeah.
And they basically said, don't do this. It's not fun. Yeah. It just makes the worst experience. Mm-hmm. But there's other options as well. For example, you could sneakily just buff the worst player and slowly give less and less buffs as you go up. This is actually the Mario Party approach in many ways. In the last 5 turns of Mario Party, one of the worst players gets free items that makes their game better.
Yeah.
You directly buff the player who's not doing well. And this also means in a game like Mario Party that's already quite random, this is just more randomness. It doesn't even feel bad. The game's just like you randomly get a reward. Oh, cool.
Neat.
It's great.
Great, yeah.
And this is actually more effective, but it still runs into the issue of being abusable. For example, when I play Mario Party, I try to be in 3rd place or 4th place for these last 5 turns, save up my items and my money, and then explode in those last 5 turns into victory. So systems that create buffs are abusable.
Right.
And that's not fun as a new player. And my friends have started making me do things like play the game with my controller upside down because I've played too much Mario Party.
Yeah, fair enough.
Right?
Yeah.
You could debuff the players who are doing well.
Yeah.
Don't. I literally just have in my notes the word bad.
Well, it just feels like you're being penalized
You're
for being
punished
good at a
for
game.
enjoying a game.
Yeah, which totally sucks.
That is
right?
horrible.
Like every time you pick up your favorite game, the game is like, no.
But actually talking about that for a second, this is something I see really often, at least online, with inexperienced DMs in D&D. They say, this one player is overpowered and ruining my game. What do I do?
Yeah.
And then they say, oh, I'll put an enemy against them that directly counters them and makes the game, like, kills them. Or, almost kills them. And it's like, well, that's not fun.
Great.
You're punishing your player for doing well. I've seen one TM who's like, I gave my characters these magic items. How should I now counter them? And everyone in the comments is just like, don't.
Yeah.
Don't counter them. They put all this effort in to get good items.
Yeah.
Why would you then make the item useless?
This is the, like, the first season of Critical Role, right? Where, like, Laura Bailey builds a character that's, like, basically made for dragon hunting. And so Matt goes, all right, it's an Oops All Dragons campaign so that those skills can be useful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like I've played characters where I explicitly told the DM, I am building a character designed for long range because I think it's fun. First thing they do is throw us in a cave.
Yeah, cool.
Which, sure, other players did build classes that are more useful in up-close combat, but I literally can't do anything in that cave. Like, my character was debuffed in the cave because I built them so heavily for long range that in close range they're worse.
Yeah.
I literally had a worse experience. And I could go on and on. That was the worst D&D game of my life.
Yeah, and, you know, and just from a D&D perspective, like, that just also sounds like a communication problem.
Yeah,
right?
It was a one-shot at an event.
Right,
so
exactly, yeah.
Communication
so it's
problems happen way more often.
Yeah, it's where somebody sort of has a plan, and then you're like, I'm creating this character, and it might be up to the DM to just be like, you probably don't want to do that. Understand where you're going, but I have something planned that is not going to be useful.
Yeah.
Or where that won't be useful.
Yeah, and it's frustrating, I will say.
Oh,
it's
sorry,
like when one of your players play a ranger and then you put them in a city.
Yeah, I've just thought of the first, like, the Dimension 20 Fantasy High first season, where it was like, you know, when they were talking about character development and stuff, Riz Gutgak, which is one of the characters, is just basically like a sleuth, right? Like, that's his whole thing. He's playing like a high school sleuth. You know, and Brennan talks about what he did to do that. He was like, this whole like sub mystery plot didn't exist until I had a sleuth. Right? And then it was there because I had somebody who could solve it, right? Because otherwise that character's like, I'm built for solving mysteries without a mystery to solve.
Yeah. It's in balance. You're making a game less fun for one player.
Totally. So actually one of the things you can do to solve balance is to create imbalance for other players that, you know, gives value to one specific player.
Yeah. And we talked in one of our previous episodes about strategic uncertainty. This was in one of our first episodes, that you want uncertainty to be fair, but uncertainty goes down as you progress through a game. How do you make the game still fun? Well, inserting randomness is dangerous, so what do? You have to maintain uncertainty or make the game more fun with less uncertainty. And this is the same thing. Sometimes it is the best route to be okay with a character just being better.
Yeah.
Rather than focusing so heavily on balance and making the game less fun.
If you've got that like super overpowered paladin character, you know, they are obviously the target of anybody who fights your party, right? Like if you're a little band of goblins and you come up against 3 people and one of them's a sickly looking wizard, one of them's holding a lute, and the other one is in armor and 6 feet tall, like go hurt the guy that's gonna hurt you the most, right? Because that's strategic from the point of the opponent.
Exactly.
Right? That isn't a like creating an enemy to target that person. It just becomes part of the strategy of people who encounter your party.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much everything on game balance. So the goal for this episode was not to say, how do we balance a game, but more so, how do we make imbalance fun. The takeaway I want for a lot of people listening to this is that you should be balancing. If you're doing a D&D game or you're thinking about game balance, don't ask, is this game equal? Ask, is this game fun?
Yes.
And when it's not fun, it might be too balanced.
Yeah. The thing about game balance is that you should be looking to make it imbalanced so that it's better for each person.
And that's pretty much everything. So I'll thank you all so much for listening. In our next episode, we're going to be talking about cooperative games a little bit more. We focus on it a bit today because, it's coming up next.
Yeah.
Of course, we've been doing our research. So thank you all for listening.
Yeah.
I've been Gaia.
I've been Vi.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
And that's it for today's episode. But what if you wanted to listen to more? Well, our new episodes come out every Thursday at 9 p.m. Atlantic, and there are 3 different ways that you can listen. If you're in the Fredericton area of New Brunswick, Canada, you can listen live on CHSR 97.9 FM through any of your radio services. If you're not in this region or you prefer using the internet, you can tune in on chsrfm.ca at the same time, 9 p.m. Atlantic. As well, we release all of our episodes on a number of podcasting platforms online, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. So if you wanted to, you could go back right now and listen to Season 1, where Vi and I do a deep dive into the fundamental concepts of game design, rather than the hardware they'll be taking up this season. Anyways, thank you for listening, and have a good one.